Okay, sorry, I've been kind of jumping ahead, going back and forth. That's usually not my style. I usually try to stick to a pretty tight chronological style because I just think it's easier to learn that way. And that's what I'm going to start doing in this lecture. And I'm going to give a description of the United States going to war with Japan. So let's remember, we haven't talked about it exactly in class, but Germany, Italy, and Japan, and Italy is always the junior partner here, had signed an alliance treaty and formed the Triple Axis in 1940. So there's an alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan, and of course that didn't work out to Germany's advantage because the Japanese ambassador to Berlin couldn't keep his mouth shut, and the U.S. had broken the Japanese code, the diplomatic code. So through purple, what became magic, the U.S. is able to learn a great deal about Germany via the Japanese ambassador. Isn't that really a fascinating angle on World War One? So this so-called Axis powers didn't really work out very well for Hitler, thank God. So let's talk about the Japanese decision to bomb Pearl Harbor. Um, the Japanese made a number of miscalculations. They thought the U.S. was kind of a weak society. It wasn't a warlike society. The Japanese really underestimated the what it would mean to bomb and anger the United States. They totally underestimated U.S. willpower, in other words, and what it would mean, the anger that would happen in the United States should the U.S. be bombed. So that was a big mistake. Uh, uh, Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese officer that was killed. You read about it in the book this week. He was the officer that who drew up the Pearl Harbor plans and commanded the strike force on Pearl Harbor. He had actually gone to school in the United States. He'd spent a year or so at Harvard, and he was one member of the Japanese elite who he understood very well the extent of the United States industrial capacity. And in the late 1930s, something like that, one of the Japanese politicians asked him about what if we go to war with the U.S. And Yamamoto very famously said, well, if we strike the United States, we can run wild for 6 months, but after that, all bets are off. And basically, that's exactly what happened. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese did run wild. They did conquer the Dutch East Indies. They did conquer, and the Philippines, and extended their empire. But it really, the high point of the Japanese ended 6 months after Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese underestimated U.S. willpower, U.S. industrial capacity, U.S. military capacity. The Japanese kind of fooled themselves into thinking that the U.S. would just come to the peace table and strike a bargain with the Japanese. That was not the way we rolled. Now, one of the things that might be a surprise in this course are all these rivalries between the Army and the Navy. We saw it in the book this week with the code breakers. We've already seen it in Japan. So what you had was the Army had a big say in China. And the Army, I've said many, many times, there wasn't one single dictator in Japan. There were many nodes of power among the Japanese government. And until the late 1930s, the army was in the ascendant. The army kind of ran the show in Tokyo, let me put it like this, they had the loudest voice. So, um, oh, good. A friend of mine just got good health news. So that's very good news. Anyway, I should not look at my text during lecture, but I was waiting for that one. So let's go back to the Japanese in China. Uh, In the 30s, the idea was is that the Japanese would advance in the north, i.e., China, and then in the Pacific area, which was basically the bailiwick of the Navy, it would be a defensive stand. It would be a defensive stand. So northern advance, southern defense. And this was a long-standing policy with the Japanese. As you well know, the Japanese had gone into Manchuria and Korea. So this had been decades in the making. But things changed. Things changed in the late 30s and early 40s. The Navy started to present a case for a Pacific War, in part because they realize it's important to maintain the Japanese supply of oil. The U.S. is too insecure, so the Japanese want to capture the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia. And but also the Navy wants a bigger share of the defense budget as well. The Army is getting the lion's share of the defense budget, and the Navy is trying to angle to get more of the defense budget. So naval officers start to agitate for offensive movement in the Pacific, especially Vietnam, especially the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, that area. Now, what happened is that in 1940, two things happened that were very significant vis-a-vis the Japanese. By 1940, the Japanese army concluded it could not win militarily in China using its current approach, that they were involved in a quagmire. It was very, very frustrating for the Japanese. At the same time, the Japanese looked over to Europe and they saw that Britain and France, and remember, who controls Vietnam during this period? It's the French, right? The French control Vietnam during this period, which is a target of the Japanese because the Japanese want the rubber that comes from Vietnam. So Hitler's success in Europe convinced Japan that they needed to start being more aggressive in the Pacific, in the South. It's the South from the point of view of the Japanese home islands, and that if they didn't become more aggressive in the South, that they would miss the bus. So what's happening is Japan sees Hitler just absolutely kicking ass in Europe, especially the French. Japan feels like Britain is about to go down, although of course Britain never does go down. And Japan decides it needs to become more aggressive. And the Army and the Navy both come together on this. So this is a rare alignment of the Army and the Navy. As I've talked about, the Army had gotten a bloody nose against the Soviet Union at Nomahan. And so that kind of chastened the Army. And also the Army saw the strategic sense of capturing the kind of supplies that were in the Pacific region of Southeast Asia. So you have this alignment of the Japanese Army and the Navy, and there's an agreement that what Japan would do is in China, it would continue to negotiate with the Western powers in China. Roosevelt's demanding that the Japanese pull out of China. They refuse to pull out of China. So there's a defensive posture now in China, and in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia, Japan goes on the offensive. So what you have is in September 1940, Japanese troops begin marching into northern Indochina, into the northern parts of Vietnam. And in July, Japanese troops march into southern Indochina. In other words, they take over the entire, what today is the entire country of Vietnam. And it's at this point that Roosevelt, who has been very, very frustrated with the Japanese, he announces in July of 1941 that he's cutting off U.S. oil supplies to the Japanese. Okay, so July of 1941 is just as significant as is Pearl Harbor, because the decision of Roosevelt to cut off oil supplies to Japan in July of 1941 basically forces the Japanese hand. Now, Japan still is negotiating with Washington. As late as October of 1941, there's still optimism among some Japanese officials that the U.S. and Japan can make some kind of accommodation in China. Perhaps the U.S. will allow Japan to keep some of the territory that it's captured in China, that the U.S. will make a deal with Japan, although that never happened. So what happens is Japan goes into what's now Vietnam. By the summer of 1941, Japan has captured Vietnam. It was controlled by the French at that point. July of 1941, Roosevelt cuts off oil supplies to Japan. Japan starts preparing for war against the United States, while at the same time still negotiating with the United States. So that's the sequence of events that leads up to Pearl Harbor, which I'll talk about in the next podcast.